Hello, and welcome to Courageous Conversations about Mental Health in Circus. I'm Janelle Peters, also known as Circ Psych, and I have the pleasure to facilitate these courageous conversations as part of an ongoing series with CircusTalk, creating space and time and bringing folks who are circus professionals together to talk about important topics in mental health, well-being, and systemic change in our field. Welcome to episode 4 of Courageous Conversations about Mental Health in Circus. I'm Janelle. I'm also a Circ Psych. My pronouns are she or they, and I'm going to be kind of the host and facilitator once again today. I'm really excited to have a couple of guests here. We're going to be talking today about sexual assault and sexual harassment in the context of circus and performing arts. And I just want to give a heads up to everybody listening and watching. This can be a heavy topic. This can be triggering. As you're listening, as you're watching, if you start to feel yourself being activated and you need to pause and take a break, listen to that. This is hopefully going to be a really lovely and warm conversation, but these topics are not inherently safe for everybody. So please take good care of yourself. I'm going to start us off with a round of introductions. And I'm actually going to introduce myself last this time because otherwise we'll be talking for 5 minutes. So Violet, would you be open to starting us with introductions?
Go Sure. So I am Violet Defiant Livingston. I use she, her pronouns. I am a smallish, light-skinned woman with a gray streak in my hair. And I'm wearing a white shirt over a pink shirt. It's a white button down over a pink shirt and some dangly silver earrings. I am currently on Abenaki land, which is also known now as Brattleboro, Vermont. And I'm originally from Anishinaabe land, also known as Michigan, the Mitten. I am a white queer femme circus artist. My primary discipline is swinging trapeze. I just graduated from a 3-year professional training program at the New England Center for Circus Arts. And I also have a PhD in rhetoric and writing, which primarily my work focuses on queer understandings of consent. So I am also so grateful to be here and so grateful actually to specific Indigenous people in my life who have taught me a bit about how consent is also an Indigenous practice and is not something that was like invented by people just now. So what we talk about as consent has been around in a lot of different forms. So thank you so much. I'm excited to be here.
Thank you, Violet. And then Nisha, would you want to go ahead?
Sure. So nice to be here. My name is Nisha Ahuja, and my pronouns are she and they, or they and she. Sometimes I flip them around quite often. I'm a South Asian queer femish person. I am very genderqueer in many ways, but today I probably present a little bit more femme. My hair is big and curly and long and kind of shaggy. I have a black tank top on and some gold hoop earrings and a necklace and some tourmaline, if you're familiar with that stone that sits on my heart. And I have a whole bunch of ink and tats on the inside of my arms, and I wear them. Oh yeah, there's lots of ink going on between the three of us. So yes, I'm a South Asian, Canadian raised, living in the US, queerdo, and currently I am on Tongva and Chumash land, also known as LA, and I had been living in Toronto, the land of the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, Mississauga of Mississauga of the New Credit land for almost 20 years, and I was raised on Algonquin land, which is also known as Ottawa. And definitely all of those ancestral lands and people have supported my being and being able to do what I do in the world. So in deep gratitude to the Indigenous peoples of Turtle Island and their descendants. And about myself, I coming through all those places, I was a theater artist for 20 years and focused a lot on physical theater and collective creation and devised work and playwriting and directing and choreography that kind of mix in with it. And towards the tail end of that, I was just dabbling in really preliminary circus art stuff, so mostly with silks and hammock and sling. And during that period, I had also been studying traditional medicines, and I'm definitely a self-proclaimed traditional medicine nerd, and really was focusing on my ancestral tradition. So I studied Ayurvedic medicine, as well as what I call culturally rooted somatics. So really looking at yogic practices as yogic medicine, and not just an exercise or stretching, but really looking at the medicinal qualities of it. And through that process, I work a lot with dissolving the boundaries between art and medicine or wellness, and also looking at how that connects with spirituality and ceremony, as is the case in so many of our ancestral traditions across the world, especially the global south. So much of what we understand as art and circus also has very indigenously rooted practices that are ceremonial. So for me, that's a big part of what I've done all these years. And through my medicine practice, or my private practice, I work a lot with all kinds of folks, and have had a focus on working with folks with PTSD and who are survivors of sexual trauma and sexual violence. And so that brought me back to working in art, in media, and performing arts. So I work as an intimacy director in theater and performing arts and multimedia, and an intimacy coordinator in film and television. And I can talk more about that in a bit.
Thank you so much. I'm also a white person. I've got a black sweatshirt. I've got kind of a fun, queer looking haircut, long on the top, shaved on the sides. Um, and I've got brownish green eyes, a huge smile, really excited and happy to be here. And here, usually for me, is Denver, Colorado, which is the past, present, and future land of the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Ute people. And I'm originally from what we call the San Francisco Bay Area, which is the past, present, and future land of the Ohlone people. And I'm very grateful to be allowed to be here where I am. So, as we kind of dive into the content, I'm wondering if we can talk a little bit about what we are talking about when we say sexual harassment or sexual assault, maybe giving a couple of examples of what might those things look like in a circus context or in a performing arts context in particular.
Well, when we look at just sexual harassment in general, it's unwanted um, and unconsensual advances that could be more overt or could be more covert. So when I say advances, I mean of a sexual nature or unwanted attention. So this can be on that level of unwanted attention or comments about one's body or personality, or it could be about something else. It could be referencing actually another person's body or a photograph or an image. It could also mean bringing up, um, understanding that we are sexual beings, but bringing that into the workplace or the creative space when it is not necessarily a part of the content of what's being created, or sometimes even to the extreme of it's not even appropriate, to bring into a creative space. So sexual harassment can look like a lot of different things, and it can look quite subtle, um, and it can also look quite overt and in your face. So that's where it gets a bit tricky too to feel that out.
Yeah, I think about it like um, it could be force, it could be coercion, it could be manipulation, it could be power dynamics that are taken to a sexual level. There's this continuum. So I think of it like a continuum or a constellation of a lot of different things that one is not more serious than another. They're just different.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point to make, Violet, that one is not more serious than the other. They can have equal amount of impact on each other as colleagues or in a workspace or creative space.
Yeah, I think it's really important to kind of work with that concept that we have that there's like a hierarchy of like the worst is, a violent rape. And then like if somebody's just making comments, it's not a big deal. Like that way of minimizing is really dangerous because that's how things escalate as well.
Mhm. Absolutely. I think creating the culture where harassment can exist allows for sexual violence to exist. So when we're thinking of the impact of a comment um, on a person, there's also then I think there was the mention of, or when we're thinking about the impact of a comment, we're also looking at then the power dynamics that are in the room, and that has to be emphasized over and over. That whether we like it or not, very unlikely is there not a power dynamic in the room. Even in collective creative spaces, there's always a power dynamic, and we can do our best if for those of us who are interested in having more non-hierarchical lateral spaces. But for the majority of us, we're working in a, a world that is conditioned on various forms of hierarchy that inevitably by their nature are traumatic. We are living in systems that traumatize us. So that is going to be replicated in the creation space and also when we're performing, unless we are actively, trying to counter them.
I think that's a really lovely segue, already naming kind of existing power dynamics. But the next question that we have is what are some of the things that make the circus community or the circus industry or the performing arts industry or community, if we want to go a little broader, especially vulnerable or a place where sexual assault, sexual harassment, sexual violence, and like these power dynamics can thrive? Like, what are the risk factors in our field, in our industry?
Yeah, I completely agree with Nisha. Like the way I think of it is like there is no play without power. And um as much as I like to imagine we could actually make some type of beautiful community that does not have all of these power dynamics that get replicated, feel like I feel like one of the things about the circus industry that create a culture that's vulnerable to sexual violence in all of its forms is the way of thinking that says like this is how things have always been done in the circus and this is just the way they are. um, I would love to see the circus industry examine some of our assumptions about what is right, true, expected, and just the way that things are, because I feel like those assumptions are the most harmful to the most marginalized members of circus communities. So we need to have a real stake in questioning when we hear ourselves say things like that or when other people say things like that and we're just like, oh yes, of course, that's just the way that they are. um, and it doesn't need to be. And I could go into examples, but I would love to hear what other folks think.
Sure. I'm gonna take it on I'm not gonna totally answer the question, which I now have forgotten, but because of what Violet was just saying, I was like, right. And when we're talking about the structures that exist in society that are then replicated in circus, I mean, it's hard for me to engage in any work around sexual violence without talking about race and gender. And what we understand circus to be in a modern context, at least on Turtle Island, also known as North America, we have to take into consideration what colonial impact and what white supremacy as a structure, not necessarily individuals, but as a structure, has done to ceremonial arts or ceremony and art as one thing, and then what we see as circus. And if we go back to how, like, the traditions of where circus came from, it's not pretty. And I think that that's in general something we need to think about when we're thinking about circus art and performing arts as well across the board. I don't think this is just circus, but if we're talking about that, there is an aspect of exhibitionism, not in the BDSM kink way, but in a way of taking someone, exploiting them, and them being spectacle. So indigenous people of this land being spectacle. Black African or people who were brought over through the transatlantic slave trade and were enslaved were also spectacle. This happened from places where I'm from, South Asia, across, the southern global south. Many of us were taken from, or our ancestors taken from, homes and spiritual traditions that were put on display. And a lot of that became spectacle for consumption for the colonizers. I didn't know I was going to talk about this today. I didn't even think about it until I was here.
I'm so glad you are.
But this is often the kind of discourse or dialogue I'm interested in, is how are we if we're going to look at the power dynamics, we can't just point at the surface of what's happening now. Sexual harassment and sexual violence in circus and performing arts is happening now because it's based in a structure of colonization or from colonization. And I know that some of the listeners or viewers might find that a challenging thing to sit with. And so if it is, I just invite you to just hold it for a moment and think of what that, just a broader spectrum beyond your relationship and maybe attachment to circus, because there are so many beautiful things that can come from it now, but just also giving the context of where these power dynamics come from, that it's much broader than just, I'm trying to think of the right words, but I'm like, I could use Bell Hooks's terms when we're talking about white cis heteropatriarchy. This is what it looks like in practice or in actuality in a artistic space, a creative space. Anyway, I'm going on. I'll pause there.
Yeah, no, I love it. And I wonder if either or both of you would be interested or open to speaking to kind of the relationship between objectification and what we think of as sexual objectification and dehumanization, especially for female-bodied or assigned female at birth performers. The feeling of being objectified falls in that umbrella of sexual violence, right, and sexual harassment. And when we follow that, we're getting from objectification to dehumanization to the impact of colonialism to, the violence that you're discussing. And I'm wondering if we can look at that whole continuum.
Yeah, if circus comes from the whole continent here is gone through and going through colonization. The objectification of people, specifically assigned female at birth folks, happens in a particular way. And that absolutely leads to how that shows up in our creation spaces, our athletic spaces, circus being such a combination of the two. And I think there's a lot of ways that we can start or continue dismantling that. But you threaded it for us right there. I think that was really wonderful.
Violet, you mentioned that you could give some more specific examples. I think that would be helpful kind of in pulling our conversation back to the really concrete so that we can kind of continue with the questions.
Yeah.
Was that too long ago? Do you remember your example?
No, I think I've got it.
Great, go for it.
I think what Nisha is saying is so smart, which is all of these small examples are just the manifestation of colonization continuing on in this place where we are. And so, for example, some in the circus world might have what is talked about as an old school viewpoint, that a director or a coach is the ultimate authority, that you cannot say no to them or set boundaries with them. And, we were talking about the complex work that performers have to do. And one of the things that circus performers a lot of times do is we sell our willingness to take risks with our bodies, right? And so that, I feel when we're in situations with directors or coaches where the idea is that they're the ultimate authority. You can never say no to them, never set boundaries with them. That becomes, really a problem. Certainly, directors and coaches have jobs to do that are different from a performer's job or a circus student's job. But I guess I see really clearly that this mentality of respect for authority at all costs, even if it violates your boundaries, is to me the same mentality that caused, for example, the sport of gymnastics to be embroiled in problems of sexual, physical, and emotional abuse. And like Nisha was saying, both of these small examples are examples of the ways in which colonization has had this rippling effect on our culture. So I grew up doing high level gymnastics in Michigan. I teach at the same institution where Larry Nassar abused so many gymnasts and other athletes. And I really want to see the circus community change how we understand things like power, consent, risk taking, boundaries before these, outdated mentalities cause people harm in big ways or continue to cause people harm. Because I think in some cases, there have been cases where they have. So, yeah, that's my thought on that.
I love how you've highlighted the way that the old ways that we need to respect are actually extremely violent or allow for extreme violence to happen, and ongoing abuse and assault to happen. Um, and just going back to we defined sexual harassment a bit, but actually talking about what sexual assault can look like, it can look like a very extreme versions of rape. We talked about that. But it can also look, which is just as violent. And I mean, I don't want to diminish someone who's experienced other versions of sexual assault, but being touched in a way you don't want to be touched, right? And this is, so when we have these power dynamics that are at play and are ingrained in the culture of circus or performing arts, and also externally in the world, so there's no challenge to it, then someone grabbing the inside of a thigh or a butt cheek when that is not a place that needs to be touched goes unquestioned. And I find my work as an intimacy coordinator and intimacy director, so for those who are not familiar with intimacy coordinating and intimacy directing, it's like being a stunt coordinator or a fight director. A fight director is what would be in theater, and stunt coordinator is in film and television. So the equivalent of put intimacy in front of those words, and that's the equivalent of working in film and theater. And so we're there really to support the directorial creative vision, but we've also done prep work to work with actors, but we can put this across different performing arts mediums, working with the performers to understand what the level of touch they feel comfortable with. I'm working in scenes where there's simulated sex and simulated nudity, sometimes simulated sexual violence. So I've already done in-depth work with the performers, but I'm keeping the director's vision in mind. But if the performers say they don't want to do something, that's my job as a liaison between the different creative parties and sometimes costume and wardrobe and set to make sure that the actors or performers are kept safe and that their boundaries aren't violated. I don't know if that is happening more in circus at all, but I think that is one step in starting to change the culture. Like, that's why I do the work. Like, I hope that intimacy directors and coordinators, our field grows, but most of it, I'm interested in changing culture, our culture of creation and culture of art making and media making.
Yeah, thank you for describing those, because I think those roles, right, intimacy director and intimacy coordinator, might be new to a lot of listeners. They're newer to me, which, as you're describing them, like, we should have this in circus.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
I feel like with intimacy work in theater, I was doing that by default. Even as
yeah.
a young director, I was working on a project where I was working with youth who were creating, creating new work, and they wanted to explore things like sexual violence and stalking. And it was really intense stuff. And I was like 20, maybe 19. I didn't really know how to work through all that. I didn't have the depth of life experience or professional experience to offer them. But essentially, that was almost 20 years ago, and or more than that. And what I do now as an intimacy director and an intimacy coordinator are the same skills. So really, without knowing words around consent and boundary setting, like that wasn't culturally a part of what we were talking about in the late 90s. But you know, that was essentially what was being done. And so I think that it's only recently that we have a name for what we're doing, which in some ways says, wait, what was happening in those 20 years? There was like a few of us around the continent kind of doing this makeshift thing while we were directing or doing choreography. But really, if we make it a part of the, the creative personnel on a team of creators, and that it's not just the director, it's not just, coach, that there are other people there, then there becomes a third party, not to be like the consent police, but to be there as a creative visionary too, that can hold like the different aspects of what a performer might be needing. And that way the burden gets taken off of a director who maybe doesn't want to cause harm, is actually afraid to cause harm. That gets taken off of the shoulders of the director. The performer knows they have someone they can say no to a million times and not risk like being hired again, not being hired again, or being dropped by their coach, these kind of things. So seeing the role of something like an intimacy director or intimacy coordinator across the spectrum of performing arts is something I'm really hopeful for, and I think it can make a lot of change and difference in a lot of people's lives.
Yeah. Something that what you were just describing about an actor being afraid of losing their job or not being hired again really made me think of a kind of genre of examples of the way that power dynamics and sexual assault and sexual harassment can play out in circus, which is that circus is a very unregulated field. We do not have circus HR, and so a lot of people don't want it, right? It's part of the appeal of circus is that it's a little bit the Wild West, right? People are very independent. So it's a very relationship based and very reputation based industry and community. And so that means that those those power dynamics where somebody might speak ill of you if you don't go along with whatever are especially strong in this field and in this industry. And I wonder, Violet, if you want to speak a little bit to that as well.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things this tags on to something that I've been thinking about a lot, um, which is there, it seems to me that I'm sure that many performing arts are like this, but I know that circus is like this, where there's in some ways an obsession with youth. And that I feel like, leaves younger people vulnerable to often older directors, coaches, producers, casting agents who not only do they look up to and respect as as this lineage, like the people who came before you, um, is really valuable, especially in circus communities where so often we talk about the circus as our family, right? Like there are circus families who grew up in the circus, but there's also people for whom the circus is a kind of chosen family. And I think it leaves younger people really vulnerable when they look up to and respect these older directors, coaches, producers, casting agents, etc., because in some ways they have what they want and need, right? They have um, that clout, that ability to say this person is a good person to work with, this person is easy to work with, this person, and in some ways to me that reads as prioritizing a particular type of uh I don't want to say submissiveness in a bad way, but I want to say a particular type of willingness to go along, willingness to not question. And the reputation thing is huge. I mean, that's what they have told us in circus school. I had amazing experiences in circus school, but that is a big part of what a lot of people tell you in circus school, which is like, it's all about who you know. It's all about how you treat people, which I'm like, yes, I can get behind that. But then when it becomes like, it's also all about whether you're easy to work with.
It's about
That
how
is,
you'll allow yourself to be treated.
yeah, that's a red flag to me. Yeah, that's a red flag for sure.
I think about the way, like, I think this is across mediums like film and television, circus, theater, where being considered a difficult performer or actor, and that may be being called a diva in the process, like it's like the most awful thing you could be called, right? And so many people are bypassing their own needs. We've been taught to bypass our needs, our own it's interesting to be like doing such body-based work, yet all the somatic responses we might be having, we're like, let's just push that down and ignore. It's just general anxiety, except your body is being asked to do things it doesn't want to do in many, maybe in many forms, both in the art and performance, but perhaps in other ways too. So it's such a slippery slope if people aren't willing to look at the power dynamics, and it sounds like that's like the biggest factor. Yeah. And also, I think when there's, because like the idea of circus being kind of a little bit of renegade, a little bit, which is the appeal. I get it. Like run away with this. Like so many people in my life, like run away with the circus. I was like my ex-wife, my former lover, all these circus people. It's there. It's like right there in my world. So it's like I understand that appeal, and yet. If the culture of, I don't want to say circus is all rebellion, but that aspect, if it is about moving against a mainstream normativity, then part of the mainstream is, going back to the earlier conversation, is a colonial white cis heteropatriarchy. That is the mainstream. So if you're just going to go over there and replicate it, then I don't know how rebellious you're really being. Not to reverse psychology, everybody here, but if we think about it that way, if we're trying to think about like what is a normative culture that we're trying to counter, then that's something. And then the other aspect about circus family, and yes, I hear this all the time, even though I'm not, like I said, I'm not in circus world in the same way. Many of us come from generations of trauma. So family is not always safe. And I think people listening to this probably know that. Maybe we all know that too. This family is not always safe. And many of us, and socially also, are asked to override our needs in family systems. It's a part of enmesh systems where we're coerced through the power dynamics to survive. As young babies, when we like think about, I'm sure Janelle could probably talk about this as well, or talking about attachment theory and our needs as young little boo-boos, that we need our caregivers to survive. And so many of us have, for multitudes of reasons, don't grow up into adults with healthy, or I don't know, healthy is not the right word, but secure attachment systems where we can relate to other adults and people in our lives, whether work family and circus family, or in our relationships, in a way that doesn't ask us to negate our own needs in order to stay in healthy relationship, in order to survive. As babies, we needed to eat or be tucked, swaddled, or whatever it might be. And as adults, we might want to keep working, or we might want to continue being able to do what we love. And so much of it comes from the need to survive. So anyway, I've gone on many tangents in the last few minutes, so I'm going to stop there.
It's beautiful. You can go on any tangent you like. Everything you're saying is important and relevant and like meaningful for this conversation. Um, I also want to be very respectful of everyone's time, so I'm going to move us into this following questions. So we talked a little bit about the particular risk factors and vulnerabilities in circus, and we talked about those in the context of like Western culture, right? And I also want to talk about, because these are also very true, the particular things about the circus and the performing arts community and industry and world that can confer resilience and protection when it comes to sexual assault, sexual harassment, and sexual violence. What are things about us as people in these fields and about our fields that can protect us or that can help like make these things a thing of the past?
I think that one thing that's kind of simple is that in circus culture, we already talk about risk. Like we already have conversations around risk and not getting rid of risk, but just like modulating it or figuring out how to understand the level of risk that we're putting ourselves in so that we can make the best decisions for ourselves that we can in that moment, right? So we already have these conversations around risk with our physical bodies, right? Like, for example, a lot of people are like, you're so brave, you do swinging trapeze. And I'm like, but I have a safety line. I literally have a safety line. It's the reason I love to do swinging trapeze, because I have this thing that maybe in my past I haven't had. I have this like physical manifestation of a thing that is keeping me safe. And that to me is incredible. And I feel like these conversations about risk that we have been having for a long time in circus, or at least we're having in contemporary circus. I can speak to the part I've participated in. They could be applied to understanding risk around sexual assault and sexual harassment, and how to put safeguards in place. I'm not necessarily like, I think at the institutional level is great. Like the ACE ACO guidelines on working with youth, I think are important, but I also think like at the level of like community care and community accountability, um, having some conversations around risk at those levels, I think can be very valuable as well.
Mm-hmm. I think the way assessing risk, but also being able to being given the opportunity to in a process of creation. I'm not sure in terms of circus, but in at least in other rehearsal process where you can articulate, where being touched is okay for you, like something very simple, like. And I think as someone who does like the intimacy directing and coordinating, that's often what I'm creating the space for. I carve that out with the other collaborators I'm working with. But I think being able to say, this is the level of risk today that I can take. While we are working on this, I'm just not okay with my wrists being grabbed. Just that's a part where, I don't want to be touched, or my neck, or, and sometimes depending on what, discipline you're in, you have that opportunity. Obviously there's some things that are very physical contact based, but there's being given space to say, no, not here. And that's not what okay for me, encourages then shifting the culture of, it's just the director or the creative vision person who's going to tell you how to move your body and where to be touched, versus here are the places I'm cool with. And then the exciting part of the creative process is, just like kids, if we have boundaries, then we can like explode with imagination in all the other places. So like that's essentially what we can do. If there's a boundary over here, then how do we do in terms of art, if it's storytelling based, how do we tell the story this way, or how do we go through the movement with knowing that being a boundary. So I think because we work with our bodies so much, we can actually speak about it more. Like that's a tool, that's something that's already in in how we relate in a physical art form is to talk about our bodies. So that's a real strength, I think. And also I think, not that everyone can tune into the inner sensation, but when we're having stress responses when our parasympathetic nervous system, I'm going to go into this talk. Is this okay if I talk about sympathetic? So when we have our sympathetic nervous responses, which are, I'm responding to stress, it's the adrenaline, it's the cortisol, our heart rate's going up, we have butterflies in our tummy, not just because of, the nerves of being in front of people. Like when we're able to start assessing that, and that is not coming back into regulation with our parasympathetic nervous system, which helps all of that come back into a balanced state so that we can be more creative. When we're able to start tuning into the inner awareness of those responses in our body, we can start having space to maybe articulate, I need to pause, or can we take 5? Like we can start creating a culture of tuning into what's happening internally, not overriding it, because we're working with our bodies all the time anyway in these art forms.
Yeah. Violet, do you want to talk a little bit about your consent games for circus? I feel like it's such a beautiful segue into what you've created.
Yeah, I love the idea of intimacy direction, because when I made this zine, which is called Consent Games for Circus, and it has games to play to think through some of what, the elements of consent, like we've been talking about: boundaries, desire, risk, shame, loss, like all of these trauma history, like all of these elements that go into what it actually means to practice what we call consent. And some of the games that we played used like partner acrobatics, right? So I think partner acrobatics are such an interesting thing, because like, let's say I was just in a creation where there was a line of 2 high. So there was a line of people. I was at the end because I was the shortest. And then there was a person who was walking across our shoulders, right? And I remember particular moments where people would be like, hey, my collarbone's really bothering me today. Like, if you step on my shoulder, could you step on the right shoulder instead of the left shoulder? Right. And teaching people how to articulate that in the moment, that is so hard. And so that's why I feel like intimacy direction is so amazing, because there's somebody who's outside who's like, pause. My perception, there's somebody who's like kind of helping facilitate that. And that seems so cool, because I think that sometimes one of the things that can be hard for people is when all of this, physiological response is happening, it's hard to be like, let me put my logical brain on and tell you that my collarbone is hurting and I don't really want you to jab your toes into it right now, right? That hurts, right? Instead, it's physical, right? It's physiological. So that to me is very interesting. Like, how can we teach people the tools to be able to pause in the moment if they need to pause, even if it's just to say, I need to take a break, and they can't say why they need to take a break? I feel like that's important. It comes up a lot. I just taught a bunch of beginners swinging trapeze. They took a week-long workshop, and I used to be, before I taught swinging trapeze, when I taught static trapeze, I used to be an encourager, like somebody who was like, you can do it. And I realized through my process of learning what I might need and what other folks might need in terms of like trauma informed teaching, that encouragement is actually not always it. And sometimes you can't tell if somebody is actually really scared, because sometimes excitement might look like scaredness, might look like they're 30 feet in the air. So who knows what that feeling is, right? So I've kind of made a practice of being like, hey, how'd that feel? Right? Instead of being so focused on, I think we're so focused sometimes on like, oh, they want to learn all these tricks. Like they want to learn all these like cool things so they can show Instagram or whatever their friends. And trying to care a little bit less about that, like caring less about that and more about like what is the human experiencing, I think is valuable.
I wanna like highlight something that you mentioned and kind of name it a little bit more strongly, which is you talked about helping, teach and give people the skills and the permission to say, hey, stop, like I need a break, or this is what I need, right? To set their own needs out into the room. And then you also mentioned like your own experience as a coach, learning how to listen when somebody puts those needs out there. And I think approaching like, because we're talking about the way that those power dynamics are, right? And so like if a person knows how to say what they need, but the coach doesn't know how to hear it, that's just as bad as this person not knowing how to, maybe worse, right? And so when we think about the conversations we need to have as a community, we're totally jumping to the like, what do we do about it question, but that's okay. When we think about like the conversations and the training and the learning and the changes that we need in those like actual like person to person relationships in our field and in our industry, both sides kind of have to come with this willingness to be vulnerable to say what they need and to be vulnerable to hear and respond to a need that was unexpected in the moment, maybe, right?
That is so true. I mean, my coaches, Elsie and Serenity, I learned so much from them because I was actually terrified of swinging trapeze when I first started. Like I was the person who they were like, push it higher. And I was like, nope, I'm not doing that until I understand how this works. And they were so patient and not ego focused. Like it wasn't about, I want to push this student to achieve whatever level I imagine they should achieve. It was not about that. And I think that is a change that circus coaching in general could really learn from. Like care less about getting your student the biggest trick so you look amazing and care a lot more about like what is the human experience, what is the person experiencing inside of their body when they're practicing.
Yeah. I really love how you highlighted the how does that feel? That's one of my questions. I'm sure all the performers I work with, they might get sick of me asking them, but I'm, especially in film and television, it's between takes a lot of the time. Like, how does that feel? Or even when I'm doing the prep work with people, it's how does it feel? I was actually I was teaching a workshop earlier today, and I had said something like, "Does that feel okay?" And this is a question that we try to avoid.
Mm.
Um, and one of the participants, who's a theater director, pointed out, she's like, "That struck me as, that would be aggressive, or like it would create a power dynamic." I'm like, and you're right, because I totally misspoke. So really working with the open-endedness of how does it feel versus you cool, you good, that okay, because that can often just be like, yeah, let's just say yeah, because it moves into that realm of just trying to be okay. But the how does it feel really gives a lot more space for possibility. um, I also wanted to talk a little bit about like the basis of like consent, like what makes consent actually consent. So given all the power dynamics that we're talking about that are in a creative space, from the industry and of what we're working in, as well as the structures of race and gender, and all of this and how it comes into play, looking at the actuality of how consent is given and how it's received is really important. So there are many structures out there that can kind of explain the basis of consent. And one that I really like to use is the fries of consent. Do you all know fries? No? Yeah, okay. Violet knows fries. So F is that the consent is freely given.
Mm-hmm.
So that means that even within the power dynamics that are present, that no one's being coerced, manipulated, or tricked, or blackmailed. Any of the things that might push someone into giving the consent is not occurring. So, of course, that we have to do all the work around power dynamics in order to get to that. So, that is a bit of where a lot of the pre-work happens. but consent needs to be freely given. And then let's spell fries, R. So revocable, or it can be taken back. So consent is ongoing. It's not just when you sign a contract or join with a new coach or have signed onto a project. It is ongoing. So it can be taken back or changed at any time. So that's a really important part that I like to highlight. Do you want to add? I feel like I'm going on, Violet. Do you want to do the rest?
No, I love this. I don't remember all of them now. I'm like going blank. I'm like, I had a button or something with this on it though. I remember.
Oh, cool. Yay for buttons. I'm about it. I'm like, queer button culture is where it's at. We wear buttons all over everything. Okay. So I is for informed. So for consent to be genuine, full consent, people need to have deep information about what they're consenting to. So, in the case of theater, it would mean before signing on to a new play, if there's intimacy, simulated sex or nudity, we can translate that to circus as well. So we know beforehand. And then, and again, in the case of theater and film and television, this rehearsal will be dealing with the intimacy. This is the intimacy rehearsal. And then, in theater, there's intimacy calls. So we have that similar to like a stage fighting call or a music call that would happen before, it's called the half hour, before the half hour, that you know that's happening. So this is the information is clear. It's and available. And then FRIE. Oh, it's enthusiastic. Yeah. Like this, because I can't stop talking a mile a minute. So enthusiastic means that it's not like yeah, cool, or how someone's tone of voice is, what's in their body language, but that there is enthusiasm in how they're responding, that they're really in, like they're game, they're ready to do it. And then specific is the S. So again, that comes back to the information given, that we're not just saying, generally, you're going to be grabbed on the butt sometime during this sequence. It's very specific when and how, and it's set out and clear and been agreed to.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's FRIES, the FRIES of consent.
I've never heard that acronym. I love it so much. It applies so directly, at least in my experience as a coach and as a student, to spotting, right? To like physical spotting, which is a place where physical safety boundaries can get crossed really easily if we're not doing FRIES consent. And it's the kind of thing too where like the best practice at this point in a lot of circus schools is every single time that you're about to spot a student, unless you are catching them falling out of the sky, you are saying, may I touch you on your right thigh, right? Like that specific. Yeah. And that is one thing that I am so grateful has been a center of conversation among coaches, at least coaches that I've met and that I've worked with and that I know for a really long time, and is starting to become much more normal in circus training spaces. I love the FRIES. I'm totally just like excited to learn more about that. It's great.
I'm having a thought just hearing you speak about like the specificity of, may I touch your right thigh during this sequence or whatever it might be. And by doing that, especially while we're working with young people who have not necessarily been taught body autonomy and consent in the culture we live in, but by going through that process, they, in the world outside of circus, can learn to say no. Yeah. And that is huge. Like that's massive. Not to say that saying no can, prevent sexual assaults or harassment from happening, but it is a big part of letting people know what is okay and not okay for their body. So it's a bigger cultural shift that we're actually supporting by doing that. And in this workshop I taught earlier today, there's an exercise that you can do of just like, what is it to say no and to receive no? So that we can add that, Violet, to some of the games. It's just a verbal exercise of like really simple questions. And what does it feel like to say no, period? Not explaining, not overextending. And what does it feel like to receive that? So for directors and coaches to really being like, receiving the no. Okay, what's another way that I can do this to support this person in whatever you might be doing in that moment.
Yeah, there was a game that I played with like little kids, which was it was very similar to that. Like that was kind of the point of it. It was called Put Me Down. And it basically involved like bases and flyers, and the base would ask like, can I pick you up like fill in the blank? And then the flyer would respond like yes or no or maybe if this thing. And then when the flyer wanted to come down, they would say something very clear, like I suggested, put me down, because that's very, very clear. And I feel like it's funny because it's with little kids, it seems oftentimes pretty straightforward, but with adults, I find that there's so much underneath being able to say that. Like there's so much underneath being able to be like, put me down. And there's oftentimes apologies that are unnecessary. And then there's oftentimes like histories that are really much longer than they often are with little kids. And so, yeah, that's why it's a game I play with little kids, because I'm like, I don't know, with grown-ups, it's actually harder because there's so much, like, we carry so much already when we're adults, I feel like.
Yeah.
And
It,
creating this, oh, sorry, go ahead,
oh, go
Janelle.
ahead. Go ahead.
I was going to say, there's this mix. It's interesting having just done this workshop this morning, but also just thinking of like the desire for people to over explain their no. I'm like, I think many of us are like this. We want it. We don't want it to create unsafety by saying or lack of safety by saying no, but so we over explain. Like this is also a trauma response that many of us or stress response, because it's meant to keep us safe or in relationship, or in a way where we will continue working in this case. But so the over explaining can happen in different ways. But what I was going to say is something that I find really useful in my work with intimacy coordinating and intimacy directing comes from, cultures of BDSM. We have safe words when we're talking about like healthy sex. We might want to go into risky territory in our intimate lives. So, both queer culture and I think I'll say LGBTQ spectrum. So I sometimes think queer is too small, but that's how I often identify as an umbrella. I know that doesn't work for everyone, but with queer culture and kink culture and BDSM, we have safe words. So sometimes as adults, not that circus is, but it is a form of play, or, when we're creating in theater, it's play. So it's similar, kink is play. So we have safe words where we're like, pineapple is always used, pineapple or elephant or whatever, just something, because sometimes put me down can feel so um, like you're saying, it feels more appropriate for the 7-year-old to say it
Yeah.
than the 25 or 45-year-old, but it is absolutely appropriate for the adult to say it. But because of the way we've been conditioned, sometimes the safe word, it just, you don't have to explain.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or I just use, often, as many folks do, the green and yellow and red, just like they would in play spaces of the adult variety.
I want to move us to kind of our final closing question for this episode. And we've touched on this in like all different parts. And so feel free to kind of like bring back things that you've already said or that somebody else has already said or to add on. But, and this is the so what question. And it's what can circus studios, circus schools, circus companies, what can our institutions and the people in them do to prevent boundary crossing, sexual assault, sexual harassment? And another question separate, and we haven't talked much about this, so we'll see kind of how much we want to devote to it, but to addressing it when it does happen.
I have like a little go-to list of the things that I often share of like what can be done. But I think we've covered a lot of this already. But first, looking at the power dynamics that are there already. What are the power dynamics you know, in the organization or in the collective of people present? What are the power dynamics in the space? Then looking at how to create more of a culture of consent. If we live in a culture that is what we often call a rape culture, it means cultural aspects that, like we were talking about earlier, where we allow the small comments to be made, allows for the larger more aggressive assaults to happen. So we can do the opposite. Instead of a rape culture, we're creating a culture of consent and culture of care. So I think a lot of the things we've outlined today around how to create that within the interpersonal dynamics, but also maybe it's like protocol of how things are done, always asking for consent around touch, supporting people to be able to articulate boundaries and needs. And then another part that I guess the third part is, how can you tell the story, or how can you create the visual or the artistic vision if there is a boundary set? How can you be creatively flexible? Like, we're creators, like, let's play, right? So like there's so many different ways to create, to delve into creative vision. So if there's a boundary, we find another way. And I think for directors and coaches to think in that way allows us to grow as adults, but also to keep our creative impulses alive, which I think is pretty dope. So
Yes. I love that, because it's true. I mean, I think that one of the enemies of consent is, speaking of colonization, is the idea of progress, right? We're trying to progress towards something. We're trying to progress toward a creation being finished. We're trying to progress toward performing it. And because there's that drive, a lot of times I think it can be difficult to hear a no, or hear a boundary, even if it's not a full no, even if it's like, I can't do that, but I'll do this, right? It can be difficult for folks to hear that because they feel like that is preventing progress. But like you said, it's actually just opening up possibilities. Like, if that's off the table, what is all of this other stuff that's on the table? That to me is beautiful, because I'm like, that's going to be more fruitful because all of the people in the room want to do it, right? So that, yeah, exactly what you said on that. I think also one of the thoughts that I have about it is, I feel like the culture of the cultural understanding of circus as this family that's like on the fringe, which people have written entire books about that idea and how it transformed to be that. This idea of circus being a family that's on the fringe, I feel like leads to sometimes an unwillingness to hold people accountable if there was harm, because it's family. And that, combined with not enough knowledge, but there's a possibility to create more knowledge within circus around like transformative and restorative justice practices that already are existing in the world and people are practicing them, leads, like, the unwillingness to, or the fact that we haven't really brought that stuff into circus that much, I feel like leads to people who have done harm staying within circus communities without accountability. So I would say in a more simple way, one of the things that we could do is learn from Black, Indigenous, people of color who are already doing work around transformative and restorative justice practices in situations where it's not wanted that the person who has done the harm leave the community or be sort of taken out of the community. And instead, it's wanted to find some means to restore or repair or transform what happened. That's a very ungraceful way of explaining it, but yeah.
I think that's a wonderful way of explaining it. And I think about when we're talking about like being on Turtle Island and looking at restorative justice practices, like this comes from Indigenous cultures of this land. And if we talk about abolitionist culture, it is about, when we talk about decolonizing a punitive justice system, we don't necessarily need to, someone who's caused harm is also hurting. It's not to say that they can't be held accountable, but they're doing that out of a place of harm, not to excuse any of it by any means. That's not my approach, but especially if we're talking about family, there are ways to hold each other in a more loving way, that I think you've highlighted. So there's a lot of different approaches when harm has happened, but I think that if that is something that someone who's been at the kind of receiving end of that harm would like to proceed, it's a really powerful experience. And it's not necessary that everyone wants to stay
Yep.
through the process, but at least it is a longer process, but it is one that can create a lot of transform. Hence why it's called transformative justice, because it is transformative. Yes.
Perfect. Beautiful. Is there anything else as we kind of wrap up and finish up the conversation that didn't get said or that needs a little bit more attention or light shown on it before we go?
I think talking a little bit more about, if we have time to just
Yeah.
talk about when harm has happened, how to
Mhm.
approach that,
Yeah.
especially given the dynamics of, circus is family or
Yeah.
family there. It can be so scary to attend to someone who's been harmed. I don't always use the word victim because I think it can be a loaded word for people,
Hmm.
but if you identify with that, anyone who's listening or reading, then you know that is absolutely okay, of course. But I think when harm has happened, to really center the person who has been harmed.
Yeah.
I think that when people come forward to talk about something that has happened to them, it takes so much courage and strength and vulnerability, and the vulnerability of actually being harmed further. How many times in the multitude of organizations across every industry possible or community possible have people come forward and not been held? So, really taking the time to listen to the person, not undermine their experience or tell them that it could have been they are mistaken in their experience or that wasn't the intention, but really to hold with like deep heart space of, I don't know if sorry that happened is the right word, but like of like really, I'm like, we can't apologize for other people's actions, but just acknowledging that is something really horrible and challenging to go through. And I think starting there and allowing the conversation to grow from that place, and how that person would like to move forward, is deeply important when we're talking about not furthering harm or gaslighting somebody who has
Yeah.
experienced harm, but actually holding them with deep respect, for what they're speaking about, and holding with deep compassion. And also then checking in about defenses that might be coming up of like, what does this mean for our organization? Publicity. Oh my gosh. Like, yeah, that can all happen in the background, but be in the moment with the person and
Yeah.
deal with that later. Deal with your own anxieties later.
I want to add a layer to that as well. This is like my therapist hat coming out.
Yeah.
But for a person who has survived an assault or harm of some kind, and for the person that they are going to for support with that and for holding with that, to be able to recognize that those defenses that you mentioned, or that uh, kind of pull to minimize or excuse the behavior, often comes from a place of being afraid to recognize that there is grief and loss involved, right? That we have lost the impression that this person is safe to be around. We've lost the impression that our community doesn't have harm happening in it, right? We've lost our own physical sense of safety, whatever it might be. And being able to pause in that moment and name that when there is harm, there is also loss, and to sit with that in the conversation is something we rarely do in, Western culture. And we get really, really afraid of sadness. And if we make a little space for the sadness, it can let us move through that instead of pushing it away.
That's so deeply important. And another loss is the potential loss of one's own relationship with the person who has caused harm. Because the likelihood is if someone is causing harm, most of us, that doesn't align with our values of how we want to treat or want our world to be. So it does mean also the loss of potential family to acknowledge what's happening. So that defense and denial it's coming from the nervous system freaking out about some really hard stuff. Mm-hmm.
I think what both of you are talking about the sitting with, listening, and holding holding a person in community, or holding space for them is so important when we talk about like the potential for transformative or restorative justice, because we can't just jump to we can't really jump to like, well, I believe that all situations can be transformed, so let's just transform this right now, right? That's not how it works. There needs to be so much space, and that those processes also are survivor led. Like if the person who experienced harm is not interested, then there is no process, right? um yeah, and I think that's valuable.
Mm-hmm.
That being able to sit with it, and in some ways, like, who's talking about like transformative justice, like circles, like having your circles of people who you as a support person can go to people for support, even if you're not like telling them details, but you can tell them like, I'm supporting someone who has experienced a serious thing, and here's the type of support I need. Like, I think that is valuable too.
Are you talking about like the concentric circles?
Yeah.
Yeah, oh man, I have it on CircusTalk. There's like a whole post, but I can't remember the attribution right now. But that pulling the harm away from the person who's centered, basically, concept is great, beautiful. I really appreciate in this particular group, I mean, this whole conversation is just incredible and powerful. And the way that we have really steered clear of talking about punishment, right? Like we're talking about restorative justice. I'm trying to figure out what I'm trying to say here. There's something and that isn't quite it. But of not creating more systems of policing and punishing to prevent harm or to address harm, but rather approaching it from a relational and a values-based perspective. I think that it's very easy, especially in an industry or a community like circus, to say, oh, okay, well, we're going to have more rules, or we're going to have more guidelines, or we're going to have more expectations, or we're going to have a really clear, like, two strikes, three strikes, one strike policy, whatever it might be. Um, because there is pressure for our field to fall in line with kind of professional standards of other fields. And we're in this unique place with circus where we have the concerns of it being like family, of it being very based on like, you're going along, and we know that like most sexual assault happens within family systems, right? And so this is happening in circus as well. And circus is in this really unique place where we are unregulated and we do have freedom legally to try something, where an industry like manufacturing, or tech might not. And so it's a really rich ground. It's vulnerable and it's rich.
That's a powerful visioning of possibility. And it could, I mean, that would be really amazing to see if circus communities and industry could be, I don't want to say at the forefront, but like as a part of that movement towards different types of justice and accountability. And I think, like Violet said, there's also, if someone, someone doesn't want that, then they don't want, like the person who's been harmed doesn't want that, that makes sense too, completely. And there might be people listening to this who, is it okay if I swear? Because they might be like, fuck that, kick that person out. What the fuck? Keep that person away from my child, my partner, my whoever, right? Like that is completely valid too. And that might need to be a part of even a restorative or transformative justice process, of that person not being allowed in certain spaces for the protection of other people. But that doesn't mean that their humanity has to be while many people might see someone who is a sexual predator or a perpetrator of sexual violence to be not human, my personal belief is that they are. So that would be my approach, to understand their humanity. However, other people might not feel that way, and that is completely valid too. I don't want to disregard someone's absolute need for protection or need to say no. And I think that that's the conversation that just needs to be opened up more. I don't think, obviously, from our podcast we can make decisions for anybody, but to honor that many possibilities of how accountability can happen are available, given that you just said it's not a regulated industry in the same way. So that's a really beautiful place to be, in possibility land.
I agree completely. There are, as you said, a number of ways that accountability can happen. And it reminds me, I thought of the concept, the circles I was thinking of, it's pod mapping. It's from Mia Mingus and others, which is in some ways about like creating community care. Like, who are the actual people in your life who you could go to if harm happened to you? But in terms of circus culture, I feel like not instead, okay, we can have rules and guidelines that are institutional, and that's great. We should have that, right? Like, a youth probably shouldn't be in a room with one adult alone. Yep, okay, sounds good. That sounds great to me. But also, I feel like we need to think about how we can help folks in circus communities identify, like, who are the people in their pods, like, who are the people who have your back, not only if harm happens to you, but also like who are just the many connections that you have. Because I think sometimes it can feel like there's just this one person, and like maybe it's a coach, maybe it's a director, maybe it's your circus partner, and that can get a little bit dangerous if that person ends up causing you harm. Yeah.
I'm laughing because I thought you were talking about something else. I just like today did a like module on pod mapping for like an incoming professional training program of circus artists. And so like, yeah, it's happening. It's happening, Violet. The thing you want is
Awesome.
Yeah.
So big up to Mia Mingus and all, like, I think about, again, the Black, Indigenous, and people of color who have been doing disability justice and abolitionist work for decades. Like, this was stuff that, 10, 15 years ago, I remember just talking about it felt like little BIPOC queer silos. So amazing to hear that it's making its way into more, I don't want to say circus is mainstream, but more spaces.
Yeah. We're lucky to stand on the shoulders of like the people who have done this work for so long and in such more difficult conditions than right now, and we just get to keep it going, keep moving it forward.
I'm so glad to be having this conversation. It's really
For folks who are listening or who are watching who might be interested in following either of you, learning more, booking you, doing work with you, go ahead and share just a little bit about how folks can reach out to you and connect with you.
You can email me at violet@defiantcircusarts.com, or you could find me on Instagram at Violet Defiant Circus.
Nice. So you can find me in a few different places. If you're interested in learning more about intimacy coordinating and directing for whatever the art form might be, you can find me at fullspectrumintimacycoordinator.com. And if you're interested in more holistic wellness practices, from food medicine to herbs to somatic-based work and nervous system support, it's yumholisticwellness.com. And yum is a good play on words. Yum in traditional medicines that I'm connected to is connected to the heart center. It's considered what we call the bij mantra, or the seed sound of Anahata chakra, or the heart chakra. So it's yummy, but it's yum. It's also very heart-centered work. So yeah, that's yumholisticwellness.com. circustalk.com, and by email, yumwellness@gmail.com.
And you can find me on Instagram. I'm at circpsych, CIRQUE_PSYCH. And you can also email me at janelle.b.peters@gmail.com. One more huge thank you to both of you for being here and for taking the time and putting such passion and thought and wisdom into this conversation. And then also a huge thanks to CircusTalk for making this possible and for creating this series. And to everybody, of course, who's watching and who's listening for taking the time to be a part of this as well. I hope there is something in it for you. I hope you have something you can kind of take forward from here. Thank you.